My name is David Hickson, and in this video about the Hurst Cycles indicators for the MetaTrader 4 platform, I'm going to be discussing one of the ways in which I work with these indicators, which is a process that I call the Hurst Cycles story, because the indicators tell us a story about what is happening in the market and what to expect to happen in the market. Before we take a look at this particular Hurst Cycles story, I must please ask you to read and make sure that you have understood these disclaimers. The story that we're going to be looking at today is a very simple story. I'm going to tell the story in only 6 pictures. This is a chart of the British pound to US dollar. It's a 15-minute chart. And our story starts with this particular screenshot that I took at 10:30 a.m. yesterday, the 13th of October. 10:30 a.m. is the time on the MetaTrader 4 trading platform, which is actually 9:30 a.m. in Central European time. But at this particular moment, there was the beginning of a story happening in terms of the Hurst Cycles. So let me tell you what I see on this chart. And what I've done is I've applied the Hurst Cycles indicators using their default settings. And you can see there are 2 FLDs displayed, and there are some VTLs displayed, 3 VTLs actually, and we see, of course, the FLD targets. So I'm using all the default settings. I'm not doing anything special. And at this particular moment, I noticed that there was something beginning to shape up. And let me show you what that something is. First of all, over here on the 12th of October, that's at about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, price crossed down below a steeply rising one-day FLD. When it crossed down below that FLD, one of the things that we often expect it to do, and I often look for in the markets, is that price will come back to that FLD and just touch it, just tap it once or twice. And you can see that that did in fact happen over here. It came and touched the one-day FLD and over here. Now, that's not particularly significant, but it is something that we often see, and it's something that you will often see as price moves down to reach the trough of the cycle, the FLD of which it is tapping, if that makes sense. Okay, so I noticed the cross and then those 2 taps over there, and I realized that, of course, price is moving down into a one-day cycle trough, because here is the circle for that one-day cycle trough. So clearly, price is moving down into a one-day cycle trough. Is it only a one-day cycle trough? Well, no. Here is a circle for the 5-day cycle trough. That's a bit of a skew arrow. Let me clear those arrows and draw them again. So here's a circle for the 5-day cycle trough. Here's a circle for the one-day cycle trough. And here we have a 5-hour trough and a 5-hour trough over there. Those are those circles. Now, what I find interesting about this is the sort of clustering of those circles. In particular, the one-day cycle circle on the left over here, and the 5-day cycle circle on the right over there. Now, bang in the middle of those 2 circles is where you could say that is the sort of average expected time for the 5-day and the one-day cycle troughs to form. And that is pretty much right where we are at the moment. So I'm expecting a 5-day cycle trough to form. Of course, it will be synchronous with a one-day cycle trough. So I'm expecting a trough in the markets at the moment. Price has, as I've mentioned, crossed down below the one-day FLD over here. It has tapped it over here and again over there, and it's now heading down into that one-day cycle trough. So I'm looking for a one-day, or it's going to be a high magnitude trough, at least a 5-day magnitude trough. I'm looking for that trough to form soon. How will I know that that trough has formed? Well, one of the best ways of knowing is to have a look at your VTLs. When price crosses up above a VTL, then you know that a trough of the next longer cycle has formed in the market. And if you don't understand these details, then please take a look at the material we have about how Hurst cycles work and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to sort of assume that you have some understanding of Hurst cycles when I make these videos. If there are things that confuse you, then please send us an email and we'd be very happy to clarify them. But the point is that we have a 5-hour VTL, a downward VTL over here. This is this white line over here. You can see it's labeled. It says intra 1 VTL down. Now our intraday cycle, our first intraday cycle, averages about 5 hours in length. And you can actually see, if you have very good eyes, you can see the current average wavelength is 4.57 hours. So that's a 5-hour VTL which has been drawn downwards. It connects this peak over here of the 5-hour cycle with this peak of the 5-hour cycle over here. And as you can see, it was slightly breached to the upside at this point over here. Never take a VTL too seriously when it is right on the level of a fairly important FLD. Price will often come up, just cross the VTL just to tap that FLD and then drop down again, which is clearly what happened here. This VTL might be better drawn not across this peak over here, but across this peak over here. I don't bother too much with those details. What I'm looking for generally at this point is more of a story. What am I expecting? So I'm expecting a trough to form in the market. When price crosses up above the white VTL, and it's the 5-hour VTL, I will normally allow price to cross above the VTL and demonstrate that it really has crossed that VTL before I make any action in terms of my trades. So when price crosses up above that VTL, I'm going to sit up and pay attention, because it is possible that this 1-day cycle trough or 5-day cycle trough has formed in the market. So I'm looking for a trade for the bounce out of this 1-day cycle trough. Now, I don't wish to confuse you by constantly saying 1 day or maybe 5-day. The important thing for me in terms of this particular story is that we're expecting a 1-day cycle trough. That's what's important to me. I know that it's going to be of greater magnitude, so I would be interested in entering into a long trade as price bounces out of this trough. Let's have a look at the next slide in this story and see what happened. Here we are 2 hours later, and you can see that in terms of the analysis, nothing has actually changed. We still have our 1-day cycle trough circle over there and our 5-day trough circle over there. You can see price has in fact bounced up a little bit. This white VTL has been moved slightly. Why is that? Well, because the indicator has found a 5-hour peak there and another 5-hour peak over there. It has shortened the average wavelength of that 5-hour cycle in the peak analysis to 4.4 hours, still a very reasonable average length for this cycle. And so the VTL is now drawn to connect this peak with this peak over here. Now we have a much better VTL to start using to really make some decisions. Now in the previous 15-minute bar, as you can see, price broke up strongly above that 5-hour or first intraday cycle downward VTL. Now when that happens, it gives us confirmation that the next longer cycle trough has formed in the market. The next longer cycle trough is the 1-day cycle. Now, because there are 5-hour cycles for every 1-day cycle, you cannot always assume that this is the case. But when the 1-day cycle trough is due, and we're expecting it, and you've got that nice clean circle at the bottom of your chart, and then price crosses up above the 5-hour VTL, that's a very good indication that that trough has formed in the market. Now, if that 1-day cycle trough has formed in the market, then of course we're going to expect price to bounce upwards. Let me clear that and let's talk about what we're expecting now. You could have, if you were a slightly aggressive trader, you could have placed your entry at the level of the 5-hour VTL. I prefer to wait a little bit, and I expect price to come back to the VTL, because you will constantly, time and time again, see examples where price crosses the VTL, comes back to the VTL, finds support before it actually kicks upwards for its big move. Now, why might it do that? Well, because you have to look at the path that price has to take in order to bounce up from this one-day VTL, and that path is littered with FLDs and VTLs. Here you can see the one-day FLD, which price is about to reach very soon. Now, whenever price reaches an FLD, generally that FLD causes some kind of resistance. When price eventually manages to get through that FLD, which I would expect it to do if it's bouncing out of a one-day cycle trough or longer cycle trough, when it eventually breaks free of the FLD, I will expect it to generate a target, and that target will show me where this move is likely to end. But until it breaks over that FLD is very likely to form some resistance. So I wouldn't be surprised to see price come up to the FLD, meet some resistance, and then come back down to the VTL. If it gives us a nice little tap of that VTL and then bounces back up again, that might be an excellent opportunity to enter into a long trade. But the way in which you trade this story is really up to your own personal trading style. The important thing for me, and the important thing that I would like to express in this video, is the story that the Hurst Cycles indicators help you to form in your mind. So what are the obstacles to price bouncing up? First of all, we have the one-day FLD, which is over here. Then we have the two-day FLD over there. We also have two VTLs. We have the one-day VTL and we have the two-day VTL. Now, that's quite a lot of sort of resistance and difficulty in the path for price to bounce up. So we know that that's lying ahead of us. But nevertheless, if price is bouncing out of a 5-day cycle trough, which is what I suspect at this point, then I would expect it to get through that resistance. Where is it going to go? Well, let's have a look at what's happening with the peak analysis. Can you see this 5-day whisker? That shows us that in fact the 5-day cycle peak is also due fairly soon. In very simple terms, we would expect price to bounce out of a 5-day cycle trough and go up into a 5-day cycle peak. So where is that 5-day cycle peak? It is off the chart to the right. In other words, it lies in the future. So that's great. I'm expecting price to bounce out of this 5-day cycle trough and head up towards the 5-day cycle peak, which still lies in the future. It's off the chart to the right. That's my expectation. Let's take a look and see what happened a little later. Now we have jumped forward another 2.5 hours. It's now 3 p.m. in the afternoon, or 1500 MetaTrader trading platform time, and so it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon for me in Europe. And let's have a look at what has transpired. First of all, the analysis indicator has placed the 5-hour cycle trough diamond over there at the trough that I think is looking very good for our big 5-day cycle trough. Here is the 5-day cycle trough circle, which is still sitting there. What's happened to the 1-day cycle trough circle? Well, the indicator has put the 1-day cycle over there. I don't let that worry me. Yes, that's a possible position for the 1-day cycle trough, but with the 5-day circle over here, I continue to believe that this is the best position for that 1-day cycle trough. I don't bother interfering with the analysis. I don't bother trying to change it or trying to force that 1-day cycle trough in that position, because as you can see, it actually makes very little difference to the picture and to the story that these indicators are telling. In our previous picture, I mentioned that I would expect the 1-day FLD, which is this FLD over here, to provide some resistance. Can you see how price came up to the FLD, tapped it, and then it dropped down again? That's what I mean by an FLD providing some resistance. But where did price drop down to? Remember me mentioning this 5-hour VTL? And I mentioned how price will often cross above a VTL and then come down to the VTL, tap it, and that gives us a great opportunity to perhaps get into a long trade. And then price has come back up to the 1-day FLD and it's giving it another go. This kind of thing plays out time and time again in the markets. It has finally, in our previous 15-minute bar, now crossed over the 1-day FLD, and we now have our target for this move, for the bounce from this trough over here through the 1-day FLD up to this target over here. So our target is about 122,670, somewhere in that kind of range. Now, can you see some other things have started unfolding as the story develops? Because time is unfolding and new aspects to the story start getting introduced. For instance, here is our 5-hour cycle circle for the trough, not 5-hour, 5-day cycle circle, and here's our 5-day cycle peak circle. As I mentioned, I'm expecting this move to take us from the 5-day cycle trough up to the 5-day cycle peak. Now, can you see when, in terms of time, the FLD target is expected to be reached? It's right there next to that 5-day cycle peak. When I see things like that happening, things begin to make sense to me, and this is beginning to look like a fairly good target. Now, even if I had waited up until this point to actually get into a trade, I still have some profits to be made, because I'm still expecting price to move up from its current level at 122,120 all the way up to 122,670. That's my target. Things are looking good. The story is unfolding in a way that is working with the Hurst cycles. And when you have a story that is making sense and things seem to be working, then you know that you're onto a good thing. Now, let's continue to think about what has to happen to price in order for it to reach this target, now that we can actually put a price onto that target. What has to happen? Well, first of all, it has to get through the 2-day FLD. Can you see that? As much as we'd love price just to go straight up there and hit its target, it has to get through the 2-day FLD. Again, that's likely to provide some resistance. It then also has to get up through the 1-day VTL and the 2-day VTL. Now, sometimes VTLs provide resistance and support, and sometimes price just shoots through them. But we need to be aware of them, because there are possible points that are going to cause problems for our price move. Let's move forward and take a look at our next picture in this story. The time on this screenshot is 18:45, so it's 5:45 Central European time in the evening. And let's have a look and see what's been happening to our price action, our Hurst cycle story. Price has managed to cross up above this 1-day FLD. As you can see, here is the dashed line, and here is the dotted line showing us the target. Now, because it turned out to be a very tricky cross, a multiple cross of that FLD, the FLD indicator has adjusted the target, and you can see that the target for the move is now about 122.6, just over 610, 612 perhaps, something like that. So that's the target level for that move. It's been adjusted downwards, but the reason why it's been adjusted downwards is because it took price a long time to cross that FLD line. That is why the FLD targets are adjusted dynamically by the FLD indicator. So we have a slightly lower target, but nevertheless I'm still feeling really good about price coming up into this 5-day cycle peak. And I'm expecting it to reach that 1-day FLD target. But now we have another target, which I hope you can see here because it's the dark purple color. It's for the 2-day cycle. Might be a little difficult to see. But as expected, price found some resistance at this 2-day cycle FLD. And it sort of came up and touched it, crawled through it, came over it, and then came up above it. And by crossing up above the 2-day FLD, it has generated a 2-day target Now, I don't know if you are going to be able to see that, but the dotted line for the 2-day target is over there, and it is at almost exactly the same level as that 1-day FLD target. Always look out for times when two FLD targets are giving you the same level. When you see it, it's very meaningful. It's a really important part of the story. It means that the odds of that target being reached are greatly increased. So what's happening right now? Well, we have our 5-day cycle peak circle over here. And that's round about now. It was about 1 bar ago. And we have the 5-hour cycle circle on this bar that we've just seen. So we've got 2 circles right now. I would not be surprised to see a bit of a peak forming. So why might we see a peak forming? Well, do you see these ominous looking VTL lines? There's a 1-day downward sloping VTL and a 2-day downward sloping VTL. Those VTLs are probably going to provide some resistance initially for price. Now, in order for price to achieve this target up here at 122.61 whatever, in order for price to achieve that target, it has to get through those VTLs. And I am expecting it to get through those VTLs, particularly because we are expecting price to be bouncing out of a 5-day cycle trough. Here's the 5-day cycle trough circle. It's still sitting over here. So we're expecting price to bounce out of a 5-day cycle trough. If price bounces out of a 5-day cycle trough, we expect it to cross up above the 2-day downward sloping VTL. So I do expect price to cross above that VTL, but I'm also expecting a peak to form right now in the market. So is it possible that that VTL is going to provide us with some resistance? Of course it's possible. Anything is possible in the markets. And as these stories unfold, nothing is certain. I can never say with absolute 100% certainty that this is what's going to happen. But now that we have some Hurst Cycles tools to help us understand what is happening in the market, I hope you're seeing how the story unfolds. So let's take a look at our next slide. This screenshot was taken at 20:30. So about 7:30 p.m. Central European time. It's, what's that, 1 hour and 3/4 later than our previous slide. And let's have a look at what happened. Do you remember that because of the 5-day cycle circle here and the 5-hour cycle circle there, I was expecting a peak at around about this time, particularly because of these VTLs? Well, look what happened. Price came up and just tapped the 1-day VTL, almost reached the 2-day VTL, and then dropped. Where did it drop to? That's really important. Look where it dropped to. It found support at the level of the 2-day FLD. It pretty much perfectly, to within a tick as far as I can see, touched the 1-day FLD and the 5-hour or intraday 1 upward pointing VTL, which is a VTL drawn by joining this trough to this trough. So that is a legitimate VTL. Price came up, hit these VTLs over here, and came down and found support at these 3 lines here, the 2-day FLD, the 1-day FLD, and the 5-hour VTL. I hope you're seeing how these Hurst cycle lines aren't just scribbles on your chart. They provide you with really useful, almost like roadmaps in terms of what's happening. Then, having come back and found support at this VTL over here, and the 1-day FLD and the 2-day FLD, price bounced backwards, or I shouldn't say backwards, it bounced upwards, and it came up to reach the 2 targets that we had been watching, the 1-day FLD target and the 2-day FLD target. Remember those 2 target levels that were almost exactly the same, and they were at a level just over 122.610. So price very accurately hit these 2 targets, the 2-day FLD target and the 1-day FLD target. And let's quickly summarize what's happening in terms of the peaks here. There's my 5-day cycle peak circle. Here's my 2-day cycle peak circle, and we're about halfway between them. Well, not quite halfway between them, and therefore we are expecting a peak to form at the moment. Now, in many ways, that's the end of this story, because we've tracked the progress of the price movement from this trough down here up to achieving its targets over there. Many people at this point would say, okay, well, that's the end of the story, and they close their trades and they shut down their trading platforms, and that's it for the day. But I'd like to show you another slide to show you what actually happened afterwards, because of course these stories are never ending. This was the end of one particular chapter, but there's another chapter that is starting right here. So let's take a look at the final slide. This is a screenshot from 7:30 MetaTrader time, so 6:30 in the morning Central European time on the next morning. And here we can see what actually happened. Here is the peak that we were looking at that formed when those FLD targets were reached. Okay, that is that peak. There is the circle for the 5-day cycle peak, and there is the circle for the 2-day cycle peak. And that peak that we looked at in the previous slide formed over there, almost, well, not quite halfway between the two circles, perhaps about a third of the way between the 5-day and the 2-day circles. And you can see, of course, what has happened since then. Price has been falling. So that was indeed the end of that chapter of the story. We had a move up from here to here, from the trough to the peak. You can see the bit of a zigzag movement, of course, which is what we expect from a good cycle move. And what has happened since then is that price has been dropping. So I certainly would not have wanted to have stayed in a long trade at that point. The analysis indicator, as you can see, has placed a 1-day cycle peak at that peak, right where the targets were reached. And can you see what has happened since then? The story has continued evolving. Price has come down, and look at how it came up during the night and just tapped that 1-day downward VTL. Absolutely perfectly tapped it. That's a really fantastic example of how price will come back to these lines, FLD lines and VTL lines. It'll just tap them and then it'll carry on moving down. So now price is moving down, and as you can see, it has just reached its 1-day FLD, and the indicator has just started generating a target for that price cross. Although of course we expect it to find some support at the 1-day FLD, because it usually will. It'll cross down below the 1-day FLD, probably come back and touch it again, and so the story keeps on unfolding. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope that you found it useful. Please send us any emails with questions that you might have, or post comments under this video.